In the early months of 1943, as the tide of war shifted and the Allies gained control in North Africa, thousands of captured German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic to the United States. Among them were men from the Africa Corps, once under the command of General Erwin Rommel, and others captured in Tunisia and Sicily. They had been told during captivity in Europe that if shipped to America, they would face brutal treatment, endless hard labor, and even starvation. The long train journeys that followed their arrival in ports such as Norfolk, Virginia, or New York only deepened their anxiety. Behind the barbed wire of temporary holding camps, rumors circulated wildly. Some claimed they would be sent to coal mines. Others whispered that American farmers might use them like indentured servants. It was a climate of unease, uncertainty, and dread. When the trains finally rolled into the heartland, many of the Germans saw landscapes that seemed impossibly foreign. The rolling prairies of Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas were far from the bomb-scorched towns of Europe. Instead of ruined buildings and rubble, they saw endless fields of wheat and corn stretching toward the horizon. Local newspapers reported on their arrival, noting the presence of armed guards and the nervous curiosity of civilians who lined small-town stations to glimpse the enemy soldiers. Farmers were told by the War Manpower Commission that these men, despite being enemy combatants, would soon be an important part of keeping America's food production stable during the war. Inside the camps, conditions were already a shock to many POWs. They found themselves given decent bedding, medical care, and meals that often surpassed what they had received in the Wehrmacht's later campaigns. According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, to which the United States was a signatory, prisoners were entitled to fair treatment, adequate food, and opportunities for work. Camp authorities reminded them of these rights, though most Germans, hardened by war and distrustful of Allied promises, expected hidden cruelty to surface sooner or later. The first nights were marked by uncertainty. Some men, staring at the tall guard towers and fences, whispered about possible escape attempts. Others lay awake wondering if they would ever see their homeland again. Yet what weighed most heavily on their minds was the question of labor. They had heard that American farms, suffering shortages of local labor due to young men serving overseas, required manpower. Would they be dragged into the fields at gunpoint? Would they be treated like slaves? These questions lingered, shaping their earliest impressions of captivity. The arrival was not only a moment of fear for the prisoners, but also of tension for the communities that received them. For many American farmers, sons had gone off to fight in Europe or the Pacific, leaving vast fields unattended. Wartime propaganda painted Germans as ruthless, ideologically hardened enemies. And now, to their astonishment, these same enemies were stepping off trains in their small towns, dressed in uniforms with swastika patches hastily removed. The contrast between expectation and reality was jarring. Farmers saw young, weary men, many barely out of their teens, who looked less like monsters and more like ordinary laborers. Still, distrust hung heavy in the air. It was in this fragile atmosphere of suspicion and necessity that the story of German POWs and American farmers would begin. The orders to put German prisoners to work on American farms were not spontaneous decisions, but part of carefully structured wartime policy. By the summer of 1943, the War Manpower Commission and the Department of Agriculture had already calculated that without additional hands, massive crop failures could occur. With millions of American men overseas in uniform, the Midwest faced a critical shortage of laborers during planting and harvesting seasons. Government officials turned to the only available workforce large enough to fill the gap: tens of thousands of captured Germans housed in camps across the United States. The system was organized with precision. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work in non-military capacities, provided that conditions were fair and comparable to those faced by civilian workers. This meant that POWs could not be forced into dangerous industrial production, but farm work was acceptable. Contracts were drawn up between farmers and the U.S. Army, with wages formally credited to the prisoners at a standard rate of 80 cents per day, though much of this money was not handed directly to the Germans, but recorded in accounts or converted into small camp canteen credits. The farmers themselves were charged a fee per worker, usually around $3 per day, significantly less than hiring scarce local labor. By the time late summer arrived, groups of prisoners were being transported daily from their camps to the surrounding farmland. Some camps were large, holding several thousand men, while others had smaller satellite branch camps near rural towns. For example, in Nebraska alone, more than 12,000 Germans were assigned to work in the fields and canning factories by 1944. In Iowa, nearly 17,000 POWs provided the labor force that ensured the corn harvest was not lost. The economic necessity of their work quickly became evident, with local newspapers acknowledging that without the prisoners, wartime food production would have suffered catastrophic losses. The Army issued detailed regulations to govern this labor arrangement. Guards would escort the prisoners to work sites, though in many cases, once trust was established, they remained at a distance or even left the men under the supervision of farmers alone. Prisoners were warned that escape attempts would be met with severe punishment, yet the vast distances of the Midwest and the unfamiliarity of rural America discouraged most from even trying. Farmers were instructed to treat the POWs humanely, provide them with drinking water, and ensure safe conditions. Any abuse could lead to the suspension of the labor arrangement and penalties against the farmer. What startled many of the Germans was how these orders were implemented. They had anticipated hostility, yet instead they saw structured organization and an almost bureaucratic efficiency in the way their labor was integrated into the community. They were issued work clothes, often denim overalls or plain shirts, to replace their uniforms, stripping away obvious symbols of the Reich. Many of them were still suspicious, unsure whether this treatment was a facade, but they could not deny the contrast with what they had feared. There were no whips, no starvation rations, no brutal overseers. Instead, they were told simply to do the job of planting, hoeing, or harvesting. The initial suspicion did not vanish overnight, but the rules and the surprising civility of the arrangement began to unsettle their expectations. When the first groups of German POWs were delivered to rural farms in the Midwest, the encounters between them and American civilians carried a mixture of fear, caution, and curiosity. Farmers, many of whom had lost family members to the battlefields of Europe, braced themselves for the arrival of men who only months before had been their sons' enemies. Yet, when the trucks unloaded these prisoners in front of barns and fields, the sight was disarming. The Germans looked ragged, their uniforms replaced with plain work clothes stenciled with PW on the back. Most were young, often in their early 20s, pale from confinement, and seemingly as unsure of the situation as the Americans who greeted them. In some towns, local women stood at a distance to watch. Newspaper reports describe how schoolchildren gawked at the new arrivals, whispering among themselves about whether these Nazis might be dangerous. For many civilians, the propaganda of wartime had painted a terrifying picture of Germans as unyielding fanatics. Yet in reality, what they saw were tired men clutching their small personal belongings or lunch sacks issued by the camp. One Iowa farmer later recalled that he expected the prisoners to arrive snarling with hatred, but instead they appeared polite, even timid. The first moments of direct contact often set the tone. Farmers were surprised when the POWs greeted them with a respectful "Guten Tag" or attempted broken English, such as "Good morning." The army had prepared civilians by explaining the rules of engagement. Prisoners were to be treated fairly, with no shouting or unnecessary displays of hostility. Farmers were advised to focus on the work, not on politics. Still, many were astonished when the prisoners displayed manners that clashed with the hardened enemy image. A telling example comes from Minnesota, where sugar beet farmers depended heavily on POW labor in 1944. Families feared sabotage at first. They hid valuables and instructed children to stay away from the fields. But those fears quickly diminished after the first weeks, when prisoners worked diligently without signs of rebellion. In some cases, farmers even allowed them to eat lunch on the porch or under the shade of a tree, an act of trust that surprised the Germans profoundly. For the prisoners, the encounter was equally bewildering. Expecting aggression or humiliation, they instead found themselves offered water and sandwiches, sometimes even pieces of pie or fruit. Such gestures left many unsettled. They wondered if this kindness concealed some ulterior motive or if it was genuine. Some spoke quietly among themselves, questioning how their supposed enemies could be so courteous. Many had been told by Nazi propaganda that American civilians were brutal and merciless, yet their first experiences contradicted those warnings. Suspicion lingered on both sides, but the ice began to thaw in unexpected ways. Farmers noticed the POWs' curiosity about machinery and crops, while prisoners marveled at the vastness of the land and the abundance of food compared to the scarcity in war-torn Europe. These early interactions did not erase the bitterness of war, but they planted the seeds of something unexpected, a fragile, cautious respect born not from ideology, but from simple human contact in the fields of America. The daily rhythm of life in the fields quickly established itself, and for many German POWs it was unlike anything they had ever known. In Europe, war had stripped the countryside bare, leaving villages scarred by artillery fire and farms unable to meet even basic needs. By contrast, the American Midwest seemed almost impossibly fertile. Wheat fields stretched endlessly across Kansas, while in Iowa, rows of corn reached higher than the men's shoulders. Farmers explained tasks by gesture or with a few English words, and soon the prisoners were integrated into the labor routines that defined rural America. Workdays began early. Trucks from the camps often dropped groups of men at the farms before sunrise. Under the supervision of guards, or increasingly the farmers themselves, the POWs were handed tools for cultivating, weeding, or loading hay. The pace was steady but not brutal. The expectation was that they work as farmhands, not as slaves. In sugar beet regions of Minnesota and North Dakota, the labor was backbreaking, requiring long hours bent over in the fields. Yet many prisoners admitted privately that the work gave them a sense of purpose and kept them occupied, which was far better than idleness within barbed wire. Meals on the farms became an unexpected revelation. Farmers provided sandwiches, milk, and fresh fruit, while camp rations supplied hearty staples like beans, bread, and meat. Compared to the meager portions they had received during the last months of the North African campaign, the food seemed generous. Some farmers even shared seasonal treats, such as apple cider or corn on the cob, gestures that both confused and comforted the prisoners. Reports from Wisconsin described POWs writing home about American abundance, marveling that even during war, civilians lived with such plenty. Tools and machinery fascinated the Germans. Many had grown up on small European farms where work was still done largely by hand or with horses. In the United States, they encountered tractors, mechanical harvesters, and silos that dwarfed anything in their homeland. Farmers sometimes demonstrated how to operate equipment, though regulations officially prohibited giving prisoners too much freedom with machines. Still, in places like Texas cotton fields or Michigan orchards, POWs occasionally found themselves entrusted with tractors, a clear sign of the confidence they were earning. There was little of the cruelty they had feared. Although discipline was maintained, attempts to shirk work could mean punishment or the loss of privileges. The general atmosphere was pragmatic rather than harsh. The U.S. Army kept detailed records to ensure that prisoners' treatment complied with international law, and inspections by the International Red Cross confirmed that conditions were far better than many had expected. Over time, the routine created an unexpected normality. The clang of tools in the morning, the sound of tractors rumbling across fields, the chatter of farm families giving instructions, all of these replaced the noise of guns and bombers the men had once known. For the Americans, too, the presence of these enemy soldiers became less startling. They were no longer faceless enemies, but workers who shared the same blistered hands, sunburned skin, and tired muscles after long days in the fields. It was in this ordinary, repetitive labor that the foundations of trust began to grow. Although the first weeks in the fields had established a fragile sense of routine, suspicion never fully disappeared. Many German prisoners remained convinced that American friendliness was a calculated tactic, a mask that would eventually drop. They recalled the warnings drilled into them by Nazi propaganda that Americans were greedy, ruthless capitalists who despised Germans. When they were offered pie or allowed to sit under the shade of a tree, some whispered among themselves that this was merely bait to lure them into complacency. Farmers, on their part, also wrestled with doubt. While many were surprised by the politeness and work ethic of the prisoners, they could not forget that these were men whose comrades had fought against their sons and brothers overseas. In Kansas, local officials reminded farmers not to let their guard down. Rumors spread of potential sabotage, though in reality incidents were rare. The U.S. Army itself monitored interactions carefully, sending inspectors to confirm that regulations were followed and reminding both sides of the rules. Still, the more time passed, the more stories emerged of situations where suspicion slowly gave way to a more relaxed atmosphere. One striking example occurred in Nebraska in 1944, where farmers discovered that guards were often unnecessary once trust developed. Prisoners, who knew escape was nearly impossible given the vast distances, sometimes worked entire days without armed supervision. There were even reports of POWs being sent unescorted to fetch water or tools from distant barns. When the men returned dutifully, the farmers began to see them less as a threat and more as a dependable labor force. The Germans, too, were curious about American life. They noticed the farmers' modest homes, their family photographs displayed on walls, and their children running barefoot through yards. In Germany, they had been told that Americans were decadent and corrupt, yet what they observed were hard-working families living in small towns built around grain elevators, churches, and schools. The simplicity of it unsettled many prisoners, who began to question the reliability of the ideology they had been fed. Even casual conversations chipped away at suspicion. Although language barriers existed, some farmers had German ancestry and could speak a few words, which made communication easier. A farmer might ask about life in Bavaria or Prussia, while a prisoner might inquire about the strange machinery or crops they had never seen. These brief exchanges were cautious at first, but they carried significance. For the Germans, it was the first time they realized their captors did not see them merely as enemies. They were treated as men. Tensions did occasionally flare. In Texas, for instance, when prisoners refused to work on especially hot days, farmers complained, and camp authorities issued disciplinary measures. There were also cases where overly harsh farmers were reprimanded by the army for not adhering to regulations. Yet these incidents remained the exception, not the rule. Far more common were the moments when suspicion gave way to hesitant trust. Farmers learned that the POWs were unlikely to cause trouble, while the Germans discovered that kindness could sometimes be genuine. In that fragile space, the rigid walls of wartime hatred began to crack. As the months passed, what had begun as guarded exchanges gradually blossomed into genuine cultural encounters. Farmers discovered that many of the young Germans were not hardened ideologues, but former students, clerks, or farm boys themselves. Music often served as a bridge between the two worlds. In several camps across Wisconsin and Minnesota, prisoners were allowed to bring instruments or even build makeshift guitars and violins. On quiet evenings after long workdays, the Germans would sing folk songs from their homeland. To the farmers' surprise, some melodies were familiar, echoing tunes that German immigrants had carried to America generations earlier. Families would listen from porches, and sometimes children clapped along, turning the distance between enemy and neighbor into something more human. Food also became a point of unexpected sharing. Farmers' wives occasionally slipped extra portions to the POWs, offering home-baked bread, cookies, or fruit. In return, prisoners sometimes shared recipes or techniques from their own backgrounds. In Iowa, a group of POWs impressed their hosts by baking dark rye bread in makeshift ovens at the camp, which farmers were invited to taste. These simple gestures created small but meaningful bonds that went beyond official regulations. Sports played a role as well. When the harvest was over and the pressure of farm work eased, American supervisors sometimes allowed the Germans to organize soccer matches. Farmers and their children would watch from the sidelines, fascinated by a game that had little presence in the United States at the time. On occasion, Americans joined in, leading to improvised matches of soccer against baseball, laughter echoing as each side explained rules the other barely understood. These moments of playfulness broke down barriers that propaganda had tried to cement. Cultural exchange also extended to language. Some prisoners were eager to learn English, using words picked up from farmers to expand their vocabulary. Children, curious and unafraid, often acted as informal teachers, pointing at objects and saying the words aloud. Likewise, Americans with German ancestry used the chance to dust off their old family language, much to the amusement of the prisoners. The result was a patchwork of communication, half English, half German, that allowed real conversations about family, weather, or life back home. Religious faith became another shared ground. In parts of the South and Midwest, local churches organized Christmas services in which prisoners were permitted to participate under guard. Accounts describe Germans singing Stille Nacht, alongside Americans singing Silent Night, the shared carol bridging a cultural divide. Some farmers later recalled that those services, marked by candlelight and song, were moments when the reality of shared humanity outweighed the divisions of war. These experiences left impressions on both sides. For Americans, it was difficult to continue seeing the prisoners as faceless representatives of the Reich when they laughed, sang, prayed, and played like ordinary men. For Germans, the exchanges challenged their worldview, presenting an America not as the cruel oppressor painted by Nazi officials, but as a society of families, traditions, and surprising kindness. Though the war still raged across Europe and the Pacific, in the quiet fields and small towns of the United States, an unlikely cultural bridge had been built. By 1945, as the war dragged toward its conclusion in Europe, many German prisoners began to look inward, comparing their present circumstances with the harsh realities they knew from home. Letters filtered through the censors carried news of cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombings, of food shortages that left families hungry, and of uncertainty about the Reich's future. Against that backdrop, the relative comfort of their lives in American captivity seemed almost surreal. For some, this contrast was unsettling. How could they reconcile the image of America as the enemy with the generosity of farmers who offered them hot coffee after hours in the fields? A number of memoirs and post-war interviews reveal how this contradiction gnawed at the men. One soldier recalled that his training in Germany had insisted Americans were uncultured cowboys. Yet in Iowa, he watched school children attend classes in neat brick buildings while their parents worked with quiet dignity to feed a nation at war. Others reflected on the irony that they had once fought in defense of Hitler's vision of superiority, only to find themselves treated with fairness and even dignity in the land they were told was barbaric. The prisoners also paid close attention to American society. They noticed that despite wartime rationing, there was no visible desperation. Grocery stores in small towns remained stocked, families gathered at local diners, and communities continued with fairs, church picnics, and baseball games. Such normalcy stood in stark contrast to what they knew of occupied Europe, where fear and scarcity dominated daily life. For many Germans, these observations planted deep questions about the strength of democracy compared to the authoritarian control they had lived under. The war itself was never far from their minds. On occasion, farmers would share news of Allied advances: Normandy in June 1944, the liberation of Paris in August, and later the crossing of the Rhine. The prisoners digested these reports with mixed emotions: relief that the end of fighting might be near, but also anxiety about the destruction awaiting their families back home. Some found themselves confiding in the very farmers they worked alongside, expressing sorrow for wives and children left behind in cities under bombardment. Not every prisoner reached the same conclusion. A minority remained defiant, clinging to loyalty for Hitler and refusing to engage with American kindness. In some camps, pro-Nazi factions attempted to intimidate those who appeared too friendly with locals, branding them as weak or traitorous. The U.S. Army had to monitor such tensions carefully, occasionally separating hardliners from others to prevent violence. Still, the broader trend was clear. Many Germans quietly began to re-examine their beliefs. Perhaps most striking was the realization that humanity could persist even in the midst of war. A man who once charged across deserts under Rommel's command could now share a meal with the family of an Iowa farmer. A soldier who had fought in Italy might now be driving a tractor in Nebraska. These reflections did not erase the bitterness of the global conflict, but they forced the prisoners to confront a truth that Nazi ideology had denied them. Their enemies were not the monsters they had been taught to hate, but ordinary people capable of decency. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the camps that had once bustled with daily labor and cautious exchanges began preparing for a different task: sending the prisoners home. The surrender of Germany meant that thousands of men scattered across the American heartland would no longer be needed in the fields. For many farmers, the prospect of losing their new workforce created real anxiety. Wartime food production had depended heavily on these POW laborers, and without them, the burden would fall back onto families already stretched thin. Local newspapers openly worried about whether the harvests of 1945 and 1946 could be managed. The prisoners themselves faced a swirl of emotions. Repatriation was a relief for some, a chance to reunite with families and return to familiar soil. Yet others dreaded what awaited them in a homeland devastated by years of bombardment and deprivation. The contrast between the abundance they had experienced in America and the hunger they expected in Germany was stark. Some even expressed reluctance to leave, having found a strange sense of stability in their captivity. The process of repatriation unfolded in stages. Many POWs were first transferred to camps in Britain or France to help with reconstruction before finally being released back into Germany in 1946. For those who had spent months or even years alongside American farmers, departure often carried a surprising weight of sadness. Farmers who had once greeted the men with suspicion now shook their hands in farewell, sometimes slipping small gifts like photographs, letters, or pocket knives into their hands as tokens of respect. In rare cases, lifelong friendships were forged, with correspondence continuing across the Atlantic well into the post-war years. Back in Germany, the memories of captivity lingered. Some men told their families of the shocking kindness they had received. Accounts describe former soldiers sharing stories of apple pie, church services, or soccer matches with Americans who treated them as equals rather than enemies. These testimonies often clashed with the bitterness of defeat and the devastation around them, yet they planted seeds of a more nuanced understanding of America. For some, these experiences later shaped careers in diplomacy, business, or cultural exchange as they carried forward the unexpected lessons learned in the fields of Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota. The United States, too, was subtly shaped by the experiment. Though many communities were initially reluctant to host POWs, they later recognized the practicality and even the humanity of the program. Farmers wrote letters to the government praising the reliability of the Germans, while some local histories remembered those years as a curious moment when enemies became temporary neighbors. What remained most powerful, however, was the impression etched into the minds of the men who had once been soldiers of the Reich. They had marched into war under the belief that America was ruthless and alien. Yet when they left, many carried with them images of warm kitchens, vast golden fields, and families who had treated them not with hatred, but with a dignity that transcended conflict. For countless German POWs, those months or years in the American countryside left a mark that no propaganda could erase.